It is a little past midnight, somewhere in the late 1960s, 8 miles outside Beaumont, Texas. A man in his 30s is tearing the house apart looking for car keys. There are none. His wife has taken every single one because she knows exactly where he'll drive if she doesn't. And then, through the window, he sees it, sitting under the porch light like an answer to a prayer. A riding lawnmower. Top speed, 5 miles an hour. He climbs on, points it down the highway, and rides it all the way into town, to the liquor store. The man on the lawnmower is, by many accounts, the greatest country singer who ever lived. He doesn't know yet that in 10 years he will fire a .38 revolver at his best friend and then calmly announce he's going home. He doesn't know that in one single year he will skip 54 of his own concerts, or that whiskey and cocaine will shrink him to 97 pounds. And he doesn't know that the woman he is about to marry, the first lady of country music, will one day be found dead on her living room couch at 55, and dug back out of the ground a year later while the cameras roll. For George Jones and Tammy Wynette, most of the damage was still to come. Welcome to Country Mysteries. George Glenn Jones was born on September 12, 1931 in Saratoga, Texas, a speck of a town in the Big Thicket, a stretch of East Texas swamp and pine where the roads gave up before the mosquitoes did. He was the 8th child of George Washington Jones, a truck driver and pipeline worker who drank the way other men breathed. By George's own account, his father would come home from the bars in the middle of the night, drag the children out of bed, and order them to sing for him, with a beating waiting if they refused. Years later, George put it simply. He learned to sing for the worst audience in the world before he ever met a sober one. When he was 9, his parents bought him his first guitar, a Gene Autry model. By 11, he was playing for coins on the streets of Beaumont. As the story goes, his first day busking earned him $24, more than his father made in a week, and young George promptly blew all of it in a penny arcade. His first paycheck and his first lesson in money management. It would not be his last problem with either. 300 miles east, on a cotton farm near Tremont in Itawamba County, Mississippi, Virginia Wynette Pugh was born on May 5, 1942. Her father, William Hollis Pugh, was a farmer and an amateur musician who died of a brain tumor before his daughter was a year old. He left behind a piano, a guitar, and, according to family accounts, a dying wish that his little girl would make music her life. What she got instead, for the first 17 years, was the cotton field. She was working the rows by age 7. Decades later, as a superstar, she kept a crystal bowl filled with raw cotton in her mansion, just to remember, which, honestly, is the most country music sentence I have ever said out loud. A month before her high school graduation in 1959, she married a construction worker named Upal Bird. By 23, she had 3 daughters, no money, and a husband who moved the family from shack to shack chasing work that never materialized. She enrolled in beautician school because hair, unlike a singing career, paid actual money. 2 children of dirt-poor depression country, one singing for beatings, one daydreaming in a cotton row. Both of them were about to claw their way into Nashville and into each other's lives, one flipped dining table at a time. But we're not there yet. George got out of Texas the traditional way: honky-tonks, a failed teenage marriage, and the United States Marine Corps, where he served until 1953. Back in Beaumont, a producer named Pappy Daly signed him to Star Day Records. In 1955, Why Baby Why cracked the country top 5, and the boy who sang for coins had a career. He also had a nickname, the Possum, courtesy of his close-set eyes and turned-up nose. He hated it. Naturally, it stuck for 60 years. In 1959 came his first #1, White Lightning, a song about moonshine, which is what writers call foreshadowing. By several accounts from that session, George was so drunk it took over 80 takes to get the vocal down. The bass player's fingers were reportedly bleeding by the end. The industry's response to all this was to keep pouring. Frank Sinatra would later reportedly call him the second best singer in the world, and nobody in Nashville argued much with the ranking. Tammy's road was longer and considerably less charming. By 1965, she was divorced, living in government housing in Birmingham with 3 kids, working in a beauty salon for $45 a week, and singing at 6 in the morning on a local TV show before her shift. In 1966, she loaded the children into the car and moved to Nashville, with no job and no contacts. Label after label along Music Row turned her down. The last door she knocked on belonged to Epic Records producer Billy Sherrill, the man who would change everything. He heard her sing, signed her, and, as the story goes, looked at her ponytail and said she reminded him of Debbie Reynolds in the movie Tammy and the Bachelor. Virginia Pugh walked out of that office as Tammy Wynette. Her first single, Apartment Number 9, came out that same year. And here's a detail I genuinely love. For years afterward, through the gold records, through the arenas, Tammy quietly kept renewing her hairdresser's license every single year. The First Lady of country music never stopped keeping a backup plan. Given what was coming, you can't really blame her. What came first, though, was the throne. Between 1967 and 1968, Tammy Wynette ran off a streak Nashville had never seen from a woman. I Don't Want to Play House, #1, and a Grammy. Divorcee, #1. And then, in August 1968, she and Billy Sherrill finished a song in, by both of their accounts, about 15 minutes at the end of a session. It was called Stand By Your Man. It became her signature, her curse, and one of the biggest-selling singles a woman had ever cut in country music. Feminists picketed it, disc jockeys wore it out, and Tammy spent the next 30 years explaining that a 15-minute song was not, in fact, her entire philosophy of marriage. Considering the marriage she was about to enter, the irony writes itself. Because by then, Tammy had a problem. 2, actually. Her second husband, a songwriter named Don Chappell, and her childhood idol, George Jones, who had started dropping by the house. One evening in 1968, George sat at their dinner table while Tammy and Chappell argued. Chappell cursed at her, and George Jones, guest, legend, and walking bottle of white lightning, stood up and flipped the entire dining table over, dishes and all. When Tammy asked what on earth he was doing, he announced that he was in love with her. She later admitted she'd had exactly the same secret. It is, at least in my opinion, the most George Jones way imaginable to declare your feelings. Total property damage, 0 warning. The couple told the press they had secretly married in August of 1968. That was a lie. The actual wedding happened on February 16, 1969, in Ringgold, Georgia. Country music's first couple began their marriage 6 months deep in a publicity fiction. Keep that in mind for later, because pretending things at home were fine was about to become the family business. On paper, the years that followed were heaven. Mr. and Mrs. Country Music toured in a bus with their names painted on the side. Their daughter, Tamala Georgette, was born in October 1970. They bought a plantation house in Lakeland, Florida, and even built their own venue on the grounds. The duets poured out. Take Me, The Ceremony, a wedding vow set to music. George said it best. When we were on stage, we were in our own little heaven. Offstage, heaven had a drinking problem. Tammy learned what George's first 2 wives already knew. If you don't hide the keys, he drives to the liquor store. And if you do hide the keys, well. Tammy told her own version of the Lawnmower story in her autobiography, waking at 1 in the morning to an empty bed, all the cars still in the garage, and finding George 10 miles away at a bar with the riding mower parked outside. George, in his memoir, said his mower ride years earlier, during his previous marriage. Biographers have argued about it ever since. The simplest explanation, knowing George, is that he liked the trick so much he used it twice. When your drinking stories need a fact-checker, that's generally a sign. It got darker than lawnmowers. George missed shows. George disappeared for days. By Tammy's account, when the whiskey ran deep enough, a different man came out entirely. She filed for divorce in 1973, then took him back, and the reconciliation produced a #1 single, "We're Gonna Hold On." That's the beautiful, slightly deranged thing about this marriage. Every crisis charted. They fought at home, and then sold the fight back to America as a duet, and America bought every copy. They couldn't hold on. After one final blow-up, Tammy filed again, and on March 21, 1975, the divorce was final. The woman who spelled out divorce for a living had gone through 3 of them by 32. And here's the part nobody saw coming. The divorce didn't end the duets. Their 2 biggest hits as a couple were still ahead of them after the marriage was dead. Nashville is the only town on earth where that sentence makes business sense. Golden Ring went to #1 in 1976. Near You went to #1 in 1977. A divorced couple standing on stages night after night singing love songs to each other for money. Tammy called the shows painful. The label called them profitable. The label won. And then George Jones fell off the edge of the world. Sometime in the late 70s, cocaine joined the whiskey, by some accounts introduced to him on the road as a way to keep him upright enough to perform. The math went the other way. In 1979 alone, George Jones missed 54 of his own concerts. Promoters started calling him No-Show Jones, and fans started suing. His weight dropped to 97 pounds, a country legend living mostly on whiskey, cocaine, and canned sausages. Friends described him carrying on entire conversations as D-Doodle, a Donald Duck voice that would argue with George and sometimes win. I want to be clear that this is not color commentary. This is documented psychiatric history. In September 1978, in Florence, Alabama, his oldest friend and songwriter, Earl "Peanut" Montgomery, told George he'd found religion and quit drinking. George's response was to pull a .38 and fire it at Peanut's car window. Montgomery described it himself years later. "He shot at me, POW, like that. He missed me, and then he pulled that trigger back on that .38 again, and I could hear it. He just looked at me and said, 'Well, Peanut, I'm going to the house,' like nothing had ever happened." Montgomery, being a better friend than George deserved that night, never pressed charges. In 1979, George was committed to Hillcrest Psychiatric Hospital in Birmingham, bankrupt, hallucinating, and, according to those around him, fully expected to be the next country legend to die young. Remember that expectation. The wrong spouse was going to fulfill it. Because Tammy's life after George looks, in the record, like something out of a stalker film. A 6-week marriage to a businessman named Michael Tomlin. Then, in July 1978, husband number 5, songwriter and producer George Ritchie. And all around that wedding, a storm of incidents that Nashville police never solved. Her house burglarized again and again. Phones tapped, fires set. 8X marks scrawled on the property. A stranger attempting to grab 9-year-old Georgette from school. And then, on October 4, 1978, Tammy Wynette told police that a masked man with a pistol had forced his way into her Cadillac at a Nashville shopping center, driven her 80 miles, beaten her, and thrown her out of the car. "All I could see was a brown glove, a lot of hair on his arm, and 2 inches of gun barrel," she told People magazine. Nashville detectives called the case very puzzling. No suspect was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. She survived it, wrote about it, was photographed with the bruises, and for 22 years that was the story. Then her own daughter published a book that suggested the kidnapping wasn't what it seemed. But we'll get to that. First, George Jones has to be resurrected. In early 1980, Billy Sherrill handed the half-dead possum a ballad that two writers, Bobby Braddock and Curly Putman, had been rewriting since 1977. A song about a man who loves a woman until the day he dies, because that's the only thing that can make him stop. George hated it. His actual quote, one of the most famous in country history, "Nobody'll buy that morbid son of a bitch." Sherrill reportedly bet him $100 it would go to #1. He Stopped Loving Her Today was released in April 1980. It went to #1, sold 1 million copies, won George a Grammy, made him CMA Male Vocalist of the Year 2 years running, and is still, in poll after poll, voted the greatest country song ever recorded. George paid Sherrill his $100. A 3-minute song about loving your ex until it kills you saved the career of a man who was singing it every night in the general direction of Tammy Wynette. If you can write a better metaphor than that, Nashville would like your number. The song saved the career. It did not save the man. Not yet. In 1982 alone, George was arrested for DUI in Tennessee and indicted in Mississippi after being clocked at 91 miles per hour with a vial of cocaine in the car. What finally worked wasn't rehab or religion, but a woman from Louisiana named Nancy Sepulvedo, who married him in March 1983 and spent the next years doing the unglamorous work of keeping George Jones alive. It mostly held. There was one catastrophic relapse. On March 6, 1999, George crashed his SUV into a bridge near his home outside Nashville. Critical condition, weeks in the hospital, and, reportedly, an open bottle of vodka found in the wreck. He pleaded guilty to driving under the influence, and, by his own telling, that bridge finally did what 4 decades of warnings couldn't. Tammy never got a bridge. She got doctors. Years of intestinal problems and shoddy operations, by her own count and her biographers, dozens of hospitalizations and many major surgeries, turned into a dependence on prescription painkillers. To her credit, she said it out loud. In November 1986, she checked herself into the Betty Ford Center, but the pain kept coming. The tours kept getting booked, and the medications kept getting prescribed. By the end, administered at home, by her husband, on instructions phoned in from a doctor in Pittsburgh named Wallace Marsh. On April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette was found dead on the couch of her Nashville home. She was 55. There was no autopsy. Her doctor, over the phone, from Pittsburgh, attributed the death to a blood clot. Within 3 days, she was embalmed, buried, and eulogized at the Ryman Auditorium in a memorial broadcast live on CNN. Case closed, said everyone whose name was on the paperwork. Her daughters did not say case closed. In April 1999, 3 of them filed a $50 million wrongful death lawsuit against Wallace Marsh and against George Ritchie, the husband. They alleged that their mother's condition was mismanaged, that she was pumped full of powerful drugs at home instead of being taken to a hospital. Ritchie demanded her body be exhumed to clear his name, and on April 14, 1999, 1 year after the funeral, Tammy Wynette came back out of the ground. The autopsy, announced by the Davidson County Medical Examiner, found heart failure caused by repeated blood clots, natural causes, with traces of the sedatives Versed and Phenergan in her body. And one more finding, the one that matters. After a year in the grave, the examiner said, the role the drugs played in her death was impossible to determine. The one question the exhumation existed to answer was the one question it couldn't. Ritchie was eventually dropped from the suit. The case against Dr. Marsh ended in 2002 in a confidential, out-of-court settlement. No wrongdoing was ever established against anyone. And in 2000, daughter Jackie Daly's book added the final, disturbing footnote. She wrote that her mother had privately told a very different story about the famous 1978 kidnapping, that, according to what Tammy confided, the beating was real, but the masked stranger was not. Daly and her sisters came to believe the injuries were inflicted much closer to home by Ritchie himself, an allegation he furiously denied until his death in 2010, and which was never proven in any court. Two versions of the same bruises, 22 years apart. The masked man, if he ever existed, was never found, and every person who could settle it for certain is now gone. George outlived nearly everybody. Sober, touring, cheerfully self-mocking, he even filmed a video riding a lawnmower, because if the world won't let you forget a story, you might as well charge admission to it. He died on April 26, 2013, in Nashville at 81, a man who had been confidently predicted to die at 40. He was elected to the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1992. Tammy followed in 1998, months after her death, because the industry's timing is nothing if not consistent. He Stopped Loving Her Today sits in the Library of Congress National Recording Registry, and Stand By Your Man remains one of the most recorded, most argued about songs a woman ever cut. Their daughter, Georgette, sings both catalogs today, and the two of them never really let go. The reunion album they cut in 1995, 20 years after the divorce, was called simply One. Tammy was on stage with George until 3 years before her death. He stopped loving her today, indeed. So here's my honest read for what it's worth. George Jones spent 30 years trying to destroy himself with everything a liquor store and a dealer could provide, and survived, because eventually somebody who loved him stood between him and the bottle and refused to move. Tammy Wynette did everything right by the American songbook. She stood by her men, all 5 of them, worked through the pain, took what the doctors prescribed, and it killed her at 55, quietly, on her own couch, with the people paid to protect her holding the syringe and the paperwork. The lawnmower was never the dangerous vehicle in this story, so I'll leave the verdict to you. Who failed Tammy Wynette? The doctor on the other end of the phone? The husband at her bedside? The industry that kept her on tour through 26 operations? Or a town that only writes checks for pain? Drop your verdict in the comments. If this one got under your skin, a like and a subscribe genuinely help the channel keep digging. Next time on Country Mysteries, a man who told friends over and over that a drunk would kill him, and then drove home from a gig straight into one. Johnny Horton, the premonition that came true to the letter. And Billie Jean, the woman who buried Hank Williams and Johnny Horton before her 30th birthday. The widow of 2 legends. That story is stranger than anything I could invent. I'm Roman. Thanks for riding along, and do me a favor, leave the mower in the garage. See you next week.